Pelvic Viscera, RAD 310, Sectional Anatomy, Bachelor of Science in Medical Imaging program, Chris Gibbons instructor. This medial module will provide an overview of the pelvic viscera. Sectional imaging can diagnose numerous abnormalities of the pelvic organs, including reproductive disorders, infections of the lower GI and urinary tracts, and tumors. On the left is an axial image that demonstrates a tumor within the bladder. On the right is a coronal section of the same tumor. In this image, the arrow points to the hydronephrosis of the kidney due to the tumor pressure and the obstruction of the lower ureter. Upon completion of this media module, you should be able to 1. Detail the structure, function, and location of the organs of the male pelvis. 2. Detail the structure, function, and location of the organs of the female pelvis. And then lastly, 3. Identify the pelvic viscera of males and females on sectional images. The urinary bladder serves as a temporary reservoir for urine and is located immediately posterior to the pubic symphysis in both genders. In females, the bladder is also immediately anterior to the uterus. The bladder is very flexible and can hold as much as 750 milliliters of urine. The bladder has 4 surfaces and 4 angles. The 4 surfaces are the superior surface, this is the body of the bladder, the posterior or fundus or base of the bladder, and lastly we have the 2 infralateral surfaces. There are 4 angles. There's the anterior angle, that's the bladder apex. We have the inferior angle, that's the bladder neck. That's formed by the junction of the posterior and infralateral surfaces. And then lastly, we have the posterolateral angles. That's the site of the ureter entrances. The distal portion of the large intestines is the rectum. Measuring about 15 centimeters in length, the rectum begins at the end of the sigmoid portion and ends at the anal canal. The anatomical features of the rectum are the sacral flexure, that's the proximal curve, the perineal flexure, or the distal curve. We have the ampulla, this is the upper expandable 1/3 of the rectum. We have the transverse rectal fold. This is located between the flexures about 5 to 8 centimeters from the anus. And then lastly, we have the anal columns, and these are longitudinal folds in the distal rectum. There are 4 organs of the female reproductive system. They are the uterus, the ovaries, the uterine tubes, and the vagina. Now let's go into a little bit more detail into each one of these female reproductive organs. Well, let's go over some details in kind of a highlight fashion about each one of the female reproductive organs. Well, first we have the uterus. It's pear-shaped and it's a muscular organ. Its location is between the bladder and the rectum. It's divided into the body, or the proximal portion, and the cervix, which is the distal portion. We also have the fundus, which is an upper rounded portion of the body. There is the cornura, which is the corners of the body where the uterine tubes connect. We have 3 tissue layers in the uterus. We have the endometrium, which is the innermost layer, the myometrium, that's the thickest middle layer of muscle, and then we have the perinatrium, which is the outer serous layer. As we know, the function of the uterus is to house the fetus and protect it during pregnancy. The uterus is supported by 3 different ligaments. We have the round ligaments, the uterosacral ligaments, and the lateral cervical ligaments. Moving on to our next organ are the ovaries. They're paired. We have 2 of them, and they're almond-shaped organs. They're located on each side of the uterus. Again, they're also supported by ligaments. We have the ovarian, the suspensatory, and the broad ligaments all supporting the ovaries. And the ovaries function to produce ova and female sex hormones such as estrogen and progesterone. Next, we have the uterine tubes. Uterine tubes are about 8 to 20 centimeters long, and of course they're slender tubes. They extend laterally from each side of the uterus to the peritoneum of the corresponding ovary. They're supported by the broad ligament. We have the infundibulum, which is the terminal thick end of the uterine tubes. And we have the fimbriae, which are the small finger-like projections of the infundibulum. And as we all know, the uterine tubes function to support the transportation of the ova from the ovary to the uterus. And then lastly, we have the vagina, which is 8 to 10 centimeters that muscular tube that functions to receive the sperm and as the lower portion of the birth canal. Within the female pelvis, we have pelvic spaces. We have the vesicouterine pouch, and that is an anterior space located between the uterus and the bladder. We have the retrouterine pouch. That's the posterior space located between the uterus and the rectum. And the last space that we have within the female pelvis is the retropubic space, and that's located between the bladder and the pubic bones. Now we'll switch our attention to the male reproductive system. The primary organs found here are the testes, the epididymis, the vas deferens, the ejaculatory duct, seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, the bulbourethral gland, and lastly the penis. Let's go over the highlights for the male reproductive organs. First, we have the testes. These are paired organs. They're oval. They're suspended in the scrotum. They're comprised of lobules containing the seminiferous tubules. Now that functions to produce sperm and sex hormones. We have the epididymis, and it has three parts to the epididymis. There's a head, body, and tail. It receives the seminiferous tubercles at the head and functions to store sperm during its maturation process. Next, we have the vas deferens. This is a continuation of the tail of the epididymis. It's contained within the spermatic cord. It merges with the seminal vesicles to form the ejaculatory duct. That brings us to the ejaculatory duct. Again, it's formed by that junction of the seminal vesicles and the vas deferens. It empties sperm into the prostatic urethra. We have the seminal vesicles. These are paired glands consisting of coiled tubes that form pouches. Now, they're located lateral to the vas deferens. They're also posto-inferior to the bladder, and they are superior to the prostate. They function to produce part of the seminal fluid before ejaculation. Next, we have the prostate. This is the largest accessory gland of the male reproductive system, and it's divided into 4 zones. We have the peripheral, which is about 75% of the prostate. Central, containing about 25%. We have the transition, which is only 5%. And then we have the periurethral, which is less than 1%. The prostate surrounds the urethra. It's located inferior to the bladder, and it also functions to secrete part of the seminal fluid. Next, we have the bulbourethral glands. These are 2 small glands that may also be called Cowper's glands. They're located posterior and lateral to the urethra, and they too function to secrete part of the seminal fluid. And then lastly, we have the penis, which is that external reproductive organ. There are 2 parts. There's the root, or the attachment portion, and the body, which is the free portion. And it's composed of 3 different tissue masses. We have the copra cavernosa, which is 2 portions of the 3 tissue masses. And then lastly, we have the copra spongiosum, the last of those 3 tissue masses that compose the body, which is the free portion of the penis. This is an axial MR image of a female pelvis obtained at the level of the bottom of the sacrum. Focus on the middle of the image where the organs of the pelvis are located. At the anterior aspect, look at the location of the ovaries on each side of the uterus. Also note that the myometrium, or the muscle layer of the uterine wall, is seen in this image. Immediately inferior to the myometrium, there's a darker space. That's the cervix. Also seen here is the most posterior structure of the pelvic viscera, and that is the rectum. We're still focusing on the pelvic viscera in this axial MR image, which was obtained slightly more inferior in the pelvic cavity than the previous image. The urinary bladder is the most obvious structure. Note how the wall can be delineated from the lumen. Posterior to the bladder is the cervix, with the rectum posterior to that. This is a sagittal MR image of the female pelvis. The pubic bone is in the anterior and inferior aspect. It's that darker oval. Just above it is the bright white bladder that's visible. We also have the uterus that appears to be resting on top of the bladder in this image. Note the curved shape of the uterus. On its posterior aspect, you will find the rectum. Then shift your focus more inferior and immediately anterior to find the vagina. And then lastly, the urethra is also visible anterior to the vagina. This is a coronal MR image of the female pelvis. Focus on the center of the pelvic cavity. The superior and lateral positions are filled by loops of the small intestine. In the center of the loops, almost appearing like a donut, is the uterus. This appearance is caused by the differences in the tissue layers and the endometrial canal, which is the donut hole in this image. Just below the uterus is the urinary bladder, and the ovaries are located on each side of the uterus, which they are also just above the lateral corners of the bladder. This is an axial MR image of the male pelvis. The urinary bladder is again the most notable structure at this level. Just posterior to it are some darker gray, irregular shaped structures. These are the seminal vesicles. Also the rectum, which is seen here, again, that is the most posterior visceral structure. The focus of this axial MR image is the prostate gland. The yellow arrow points to the peripheral zone, and the red arrow points to the central zone. Note how well MR does in differentiating these two zones in this image. This is an axial CT image of the prostate. Now, as in the previous MR image, the yellow arrow indicates the peripheral zone and the red arrow marks the central zone. While there is maybe just enough contrast to distinguish the two zones, the difference is not as marked as it was in the previous axial MRI. This is an MR image of the penis along its long axis. The yellow arrows point to the tunica albuginea, which surrounds the corpora cavernosa and the spongiosum. In the part of the image that's labeled C, those are those two tissue masses that are called the corpora cavernosa. This is a coronal MR image of the scrotum. The testes are labeled T in this particular image. Superior to each of the testes are the epididymis. Shift your focus more superiorly and in the midline and note the penile structures labeled. Now shift your focus more superior and in the midline. The S structure marks the corpora spongiosum, surrounded by the urethra, marked by a white arrow. Immediately above these structures are the two corpora cavernosa. Again, they're surrounded by that tunica albuginea, that's that covering that goes around those particular two tissue masses. And then lastly, we have a sagittal MR image of the male pelvis. On the lower anterior is the penis, which is labeled with the testes. Immediately posterior to the pubic bone is the urinary bladder. Also, the prostate gland is shown here just inferior to the bladder. And the seminal vesicles appear to curve from the top of the prostate. Just posterior to these structures is the rectum.